Chapter 23. The one person the prince chose. The city looked different after being saved. Not cleaner, not calmer, only honest in a way I had never seen before. From the upper palace square, I could see how badly Violia had been hurt. One western bridge still hung crooked over the lower gardens. Two tower spines near the administration quarter bore fresh white scars where rout light had burned through stone. Whole clusters of rout lamps had gone dark and stayed dark because no one had yet dared touch them after the great rout opened. Dust still drifted from cracked cornices. People stood in places meant only for passing through and looked upward as if the sky might apologize if they stared long enough. Above us, the new opened crown of roads still burned. Not with the violent convulsion of the collapse. Not with the broken white wound Oren's forced sequence had torn into the air. This was steadier, wider, silver paths crossing and answering one another over the capital and outward toward the chains beyond. Every time I looked at it, some part of me still expected the thing to vanish and take the city's breath with it. It did not vanish. The square below the Skyheart Terrace had filled with people drawn by equal measures of terror, survival, and the fact that when a kingdom nearly falls out of the sky and then does not, no one with blood in them can bear to stay behind closed doors. Nobles came because they feared being absent from history. Merchants came because nothing matters more than a city still standing where one must trade in the morning. Servants came because they had carried half the city on their backs during the collapse and had earned the right to see what answer the heavens finally gave. Common folk from the middle terraces crowded the lower edge of the square because once the guard lines broke under urgency, no one below cared enough about old thresholds to stop at the proper distance. Guards had tried. The city had ignored them. Now the palace square held all of us in uneven layers, silk and soot, ribbons and torn sleeves, polished boots beside workmen's climbing grips, noble women with dust on their hems because no one had time left to preserve appearances when the rout crown itself had split open over Violia. I stood beside Julian at the front of the upper stair. Not hidden, not pushed behind his shoulder, not dressed for court in any way that might have softened the truth of where I came from. My coat still bore the rout dust from the spire climb. The ends of my hair had escaped whatever tie had once pretended to order them. My hands smelled faintly of silver and hot stone and old lily stem where I had touched the returning crown before it rose into the Skyheart axis and became part of the road itself. Julian looked no more composed than I did. He had changed only enough to remain standing without alarming the court further. A fresh dark coat had been thrown over his torn shirt. The right sleeve still sat stiffly where rout backlash had reddened the skin beneath. His face carried the pale afterimage of too much resonance and too little rest. Yet the weakness in him did not diminish him. If anything, it made him more impossible to look away from. No polished prince now. Only the man who had gone into the core ready to spend himself for the city and had been forced, at last, to let the road answer another way. Marcus stood one step behind us to the right with the evidence cases. Felix stood to the left clutching two copied cylinders and enough paper to damn an era. Lady Vivienne stood on Julian's other side, not behind him, not beside the noble benches, but in the visible front line where everyone in the square could see House Harrow standing with the truth and not as its substitute. That mattered. I knew it. The crowd knew it too. Below us, the noise moved in tides. What is that line over the palace? Did you see the spire open? They said the old records were false. No, not false cut. The broadside named the Belrose line. My sister saw the minister led away under guard. They won't dare claim madness now, will they? They always dare. Hush, he's speaking. Julian stepped forward to the edge of the upper stair. The whole square drew tight around him. He did not raise his hand for silence. He did not need to. The city quieted in layers until I could hear banners snapping under the new high rout wind and the far rattle of one unsettled lamp chain in the west court. That was all. Then Julian spoke. Byerlia stands, he said. No flourish. No false comfort. Only the truth first. A sound passed through the square, not a cheer, not yet. Relief remembered by thousands of bodies at once and released as one long rough breath. Julian waited until it passed. It stands, he said again, because the road above this capital was not commanded back into place. It was answered. That reached them. Not fully, perhaps, not in technical detail. But the shape of it did. I saw the people below look up in the same moment. At the open crown of silver lines over the city. At the thing no one in living memory had seen and no official broadside would ever be able to explain away as common route maintenance. Julian turned slightly, only enough that the movement included me without turning me into display. For generations, he said, this kingdom has been taught a broken version of its own survival. We were told that the old keepers of the road, the Star Weavers, endangered the sky itself. We were told their practices were reckless, their line unstable, their loss unfortunate but necessary. The word necessary moved through the square like something fouled. Many there had heard it before. In taxes. In route closures. In wartime rationing. In marriages they did not choose and work they could not refuse. Julian's voice sharpened. That history was cut. A murmur rose. He did not let it swell. The original records remain. They were not lost. They were hidden under stewardship authority and suppressed to protect a false continuity built on command instead of accord. He held out one hand toward Felix without looking away from the crowd. The evidence will be read now. Felix had spent half his life, I suspect, dreaming of a public moment exactly like this and another half pretending not to be the sort of man who would. He stepped forward with the first copied cylinder in both hands and the expression of a scholar prepared to flay a kingdom with procedure. The crystal core lit above his palm. Silver script unfolded in the bright air over the square, large enough that those near the front could see the lines form and those farther back could see the proof of official script and not merely hear a convenient summary. Felix read in a voice so clear and cold it might have been cut from the same crystal. Emergency command ring trial enacted at Western Crown support against Star Weaver objection. Weaver representatives warned force without answering line would overload West Braid harmonizers. Stewardship overruled. Ignition held 19 breaths. West Braid failed. 3 vessels lost. 2 stations destabilized. Capital Crown seal partially closed under recoil. Silence took the square. Not because no one understood. Because they did. A woman near the lower fountain put one hand hard over her mouth. A route porter from the western chain shouted a curse so heartfelt it carried even through the stunned hush. One old nobleman on the right bench actually sat down without dignity because his knees had failed him and his body had more sense than his politics. Felix did not stop. He changed cylinders and read the second. Belrose House testimony entered under protest. Statement. The route answered under shared accord until command ring seized line wait. Statement cut from public summary by stewardship review. This time the reaction broke. Not into riot. Into voices. Belrose. They cut it. Stewardship did it. They blamed the wrong line. My father said the West ships fell because the road was forced. They told us the weavers broke it. They lied. The sound rose and spread and began to turn dangerous in the way truth does when it reaches too many people who have lost too much under the older lie. Marcus stepped forward before the square could become only fury. He did not speak at first. He opened the evidence case and held up the wrapped scrap of blue-black sealant from the burst lamp sabotage. Then the custody ledger. Then the stripped transfer tags from Annex C. He laid each one on the front witness table where even those too far to read could see the ritual of proof, the objects, the chain, the ugly ordinary paperwork by which men like Oren had hidden crime inside systems and called the result order. The upper conservatory lamp, Marcus said, voice carrying with the clean force of command and no court softness at all, was sabotaged with office-grade archival sealant under restricted instruction. Witness names are recorded. Transfer logs from Annex C show the original accident materials were retained off open route inventory. The broadside issued against Miss Belrose's line was released before review while these items remained under ministerial lock. He did not need to name Oren. The crowd already had. They were not all shouting now. That would have been easier to contain. Instead, the square had become full of a lower, more dangerous sound, the sound of people reordering memory in real time. What they had believed, what they had feared, what they had allowed to be printed, preached, and sealed into public boards because it came stamped and calm. I looked at the faces below and saw the shift happen unevenly. Some with shame, some with rage, some with that blank, slow horror that comes when a lie has lived in your bones long enough to feel like architecture. Then Oren Vailcourt was brought into the square. Not dragged. Not because Marcus lacked the appetite. Because public collapse serves liars if it makes the truth look messy enough to distrust in return. 2 hero guards and 3 palace route guards escorted him from the side court arch under visible restraint. His coat had been changed. Someone had bound his hands beneath it. His face had gone a shade grayer than yesterday, not from fear exactly, but from the brutal recognition that the city had already seen too much sky to let his old language fully cover it again. When the crowd saw him, the sound sharpened. Some shouted traitor. Some shouted liar. Some shouted minister still, because deference rots slower in some people than sense. One woman from the lower quarter screamed, "Say Belrose again now," and the line hit so hard and so true that 3 people near her laughed with tears still on their faces. Oren did not look at them. He looked at Julian. Even in restraint, he tried to hold the square as a chamber. That was the core of him. Belief that if one arranged posture and language correctly enough, the world might continue mistaking control for right. "The city stands because I bought time," he said. He raised his voice only enough to reach the front rows. He knew how public acoustics worked. "If I had not forced the lower hold, the capital would have shattered before your prince reached the core. Hate me if you like. It does not alter arithmetic." I hated how cleanly he could still speak. The square hated it too. Julian descended 1 step. Not to him. Toward the crowd. That mattered. "You bought time," Julian said, the way a fire buys warmth after setting a house alight. A murmur like approval moved outward. Oren's mouth tightened. "You are alive to judge me because someone chose action over doctrine." "No," Julian said. "I am alive because your action failed and the road answered an older truth in spite of you." There it was. Not denial of the crisis. Not naive refusal of cost. The naming of failure where Oren wanted grim nobility. Julian turned, not to Oren but to the square. "The records will be opened," he said. "All of them. The stewardship cuts. The command trial notes. The witness lines removed from public history. The name Starweaver will be restored to the record it kept long before our offices learned how to mutilate the road and call the scar governments." The square took that line into itself and changed. A cheer began somewhere low on the left side, not grand, not polished. One ordinary man's answer. Then another voice took it up. Then a woman near the fountain. Then the route porters. Then the lower terrace workers who had pushed through the guard line because their city nearly fell and they had earned the right to stand where truth was finally being named. Starweaver. The word rose rough at first, disbelieving on living tongues after so long buried. Then stronger. Starweaver. Starweaver. I had never heard it said like that. Not as warning. Not as slur buried in official caution. Not as base in memory under ancient stone. Alive. Public. Returned. The force of it almost knocked the breath from me. Beside me, Vivienne stepped forward at last. She did not raise her voice the way the crowd had. She spoke as women like her change states, with precision that leaves no room for anyone else to decide later that they had misunderstood. House Harrow affirms the opening of full review, she said. We will sponsor the record restoration before the Noble Council and oppose any attempt to bury or reframe the command trial under emergency privilege. Her gaze swept the noble benches, cool and merciless. Any house that hides behind confusion now does so after seeing the road choose in full view of the city. That landed where it needed to. I saw it in the faces of the nobles below. The ones who had wavered. The ones who had hoped perhaps to let this become merely another ugly crisis and then a private settlement. Vivienne had just shut the easy door on them. One elderly duchess lifted her chin and nodded once. A younger lord looked physically ill. A merchant envoy from Glassmere laughed aloud in disbelief and relief both. Felix, who would have married documentation if the law allowed, took the opening and drove the point home like a nail. The restored files will be copied into open route inventory, he said. Multiple houses will hold witness copies. The line from Annex C is now broken. There is no plausible path by which this becomes hidden again without half the city noticing the smoke. The crowd liked that. They liked it very much. Not because archive procedure usually thrills anyone. Because it sounded like permanence. Oren still did not bend. There are men who mistake refusal to repent for strength because they have built their whole lives on the belief that outcomes cleanse means if enough people survive to benefit. He was one of them. The broadside. The command notes. The cut records. The city standing under a road he had failed to control, none of it broke him into obvious regret. What it did instead was make him smaller in the exact place he had always mistaken for greatness. He looked up at the open crown over the city, then back to Julian, and said with a weary contempt that seemed to rise not from victory but from being denied the shape of the world he preferred, "And what will you build with this truth? A kingdom that waits on mutual feeling before roads carry grain? A realm where command asks permission from every answering line before acting? You think restoration is the same thing as rule?" Julian descended the rest of the upper stair. Not quickly. Not to loom over him. Only until he stood on the same level of paving as the crowd and the accused and the city he had just helped save. Rule, he said, that requires a city to fear its own keepers and a prince to bleed in silence because no one wished to admit the road was built for 2 lines, is not rule worth preserving unchanged. Oren's face altered at last. Not much. A crack no wider than a seam in old stone. Because that cut him where he had least wanted truth to live, in the fact that the system had not merely lied about the dead. It had used the living, too, Julian's body among them. The crowd felt it without knowing the whole inward history. You can always tell when a public wound finds its center even if the people listening know only its edges. Marcus gave a signal to the guards. They moved Oren back toward the side arch. The minister did not resist. Not because he had accepted defeat. Because he still believed in time, in procedures, in the many soft corridors of power where men like him go to survive public shame if they can delay long enough for hunger and trade and habit to wash over principle. Perhaps he would have been right in another kingdom. Perhaps even in this one, on another day. But the road above us was still open and the city had seen too much. As Oren was led away, the crowd did not cheer. That would have made him too important. Instead, the sound that followed him was lower and more damning, dismissal. The rough human noise a city makes when it has judged someone smaller than the role he tried to claim for himself. When he vanished under the arch, the square seemed to inhale again. The worst truth had been spoken. The evidence laid. The old name returned. And still all of that was not, in the end, what the city's attention settled on longest. It settled on us. Not only because I stood beside Julian. not only because the broadside had named me and the open road had answered through the crown line and the woven line together wherever one could see the shape if not the mechanism. Because the entire capital now understood, whether they preferred it or not, that the road had chosen relation over command in full public witness. And relation, once seen, cannot easily be ordered back into silence. I felt the moment the square shifted from judgment to expectancy. It moved almost physically through the crowd. Whispers, glances, the odd impossible quiet that falls when thousands of people decide together that the next truth matters to them personally though it has no right to. Julian felt it too. I knew from the way his shoulders changed. He turned toward me then, not to perform for them, because there was no longer any road left around it. The upper wind from the open crown moved through the square, stirring torn banners and dusty hems and the loose strands of my hair. Somewhere beyond the lower arcades, someone began to cry from relief and not stop. The route lines above us hummed softly in their new shape, no longer hurting the sky. Julian came back up the first stair toward me. Every part of me knew what was happening before my mind could bear to give it form. My pulse had become absurd. Not graceful, not bridal, a hard wild beating thing that made my fingers clumsy against my own skirt and my breath shallow in my chest. This was not a private room, not the gallery, not the tower, not the sky-heart core where the city's life had narrowed to our joined lines. This was the palace square with nobles and porters and servants and half the capital's surviving courage looking on. I wanted to run. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to drag him into some hidden stairwell and spare us both the violence of being seen so clearly. Instead, I stood still. He stopped before me, close enough now that the square and its expectation became blur. His eyes were tired, bright, more unguarded than they had any right to be in front of so many people who would remember every line of his face later and call it history. Marcus stepped silently to one side. Felix went very still in the peculiar way scholars do when they realize reality has become more excessive than anything they would have dared annotate. Vivienne's mouth curved by the smallest degree, not in surprise, but in the look of someone watching an overdue truth stop delaying itself. Julian held out his hands. A page came forward at once from the side stair, carrying a long narrow case wrapped in royal dark cloth. I had not seen who prepared it. Perhaps no one had any ordinary sense. Perhaps some half-ruined servant or route keeper had understood on instinct what shape the square wanted next and simply acted. That felt likelier than ceremony. Julian took the case, set it on the upper stair rail, and opened it. Inside lay another crown. Not the returning crown in the Skyheart axis. Not my mother's work. New. For one heartbeat I could only stare. It was smaller than the route-opening crown and made for a living woman's hair, not a city's hidden lock. White blooms, yes, but fresher, fuller, interwoven with silver thread and one slender line of blue crystal grain that caught the open crown light above and flashed like evening sky in a bowl of water. The hidden inner band showed only if one looked as I always looked now, with the fingers first and the eyes after. I could see the work from here. Not mine. Not my mother's. A royal workshop perhaps, but corrected no, not corrected. Guided. Some hand had learned from the old pattern already. The inner turns did not trap. They returned. Julian lifted it carefully. The square went silent enough that I heard the faint brush of petals against silver. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice to meet the whole city. He spoke as if I were the person who mattered first and the city's hearing was only consequence. I was taught, he said, that a prince's public choices belong first to the realm. The crowd held its breath. I know now, he said, that the realm I wish to protect begins with what I refuse to let be traded away. The words struck so deep I almost swayed. He looked down at the crown in his hands once, then back at me. They asked me to choose stability, he said. They meant obedience. They asked me to choose blood. They meant convenience. They asked me to choose what could be arranged without risking the shape of the old order. His eyes did not leave mine. They were wrong about the road, and they were wrong about you. The square made no sound. None. I could see the Capitol below us in the edge of my vision. People standing on lower terraces with their faces turned upward. Merchants in dust-stained coats. Palace maids with cracked knuckles and soot on their sleeves. Nobles who had spent their lives learning how to be looked at and had forgotten how to look. All of them waiting. Julian took one more step up. I do not choose you because the road answered through us, he said softly. I do not choose you because the old records restore your house, or because the city now sees what I have known in quieter ways for too long. His voice dropped a little lower, and somehow the whole square still heard it. I choose you because from the first night, before I knew your name, my life has only become truer when you are in it. I could not breathe. Tears burned my eyes, and I hated them a little for choosing that moment, in front of all those people and all that sky, to become impossible to deny. He held up the crown. Cora Belrose, he said, and my whole body turned toward my own name in his mouth the way routes turn toward answering lines. Before the city, before the houses who will witness it, before the sky that nearly fell and chose us back, will you stand beside me, not as compromise, not as correction, not as hidden answer, but as the one I ask for by my own will. There are moments when life refuses to let the heart answer privately. This was one. The square. The opened crown over Violia. The route still humming in its new shape. The restored name Star Weaver alive in public mouths again. My mother's letter hidden in the satchel at my side. Master Alara perhaps somewhere below, furious if I made too much of a spectacle and more furious if I made too little. Vivienne standing witness. Marcus pretending not to feel anything and failing around the eyes. Felix openly weeping without shame because history had finally acquired taste. And Julian, holding a crown that was not a state instrument or a trap or a symbol of convenient houses. Only an asking. I laughed through tears because the alternative was to collapse and dishonor every stair I had climbed to get here. Yes, I said. The square erupted. Not polite applause. Not court approval. Joy. Rough. Startled. Human. Cheers rose from the lower terraces first, then the palace square, then the side galleries where servants had crowded and forgotten themselves, then the route workers, then the nobles who understood too late that refusing to cheer would look pettier than history might forgive. Someone shouted my name. Someone else shouted his. The two sounds tangled and vanished into the open sky. Julian smiled then. Not the public princely smile. Not the ballroom one. The real one, bright enough to make every year of caution around him look like weather passing off the sun. He set the crown on my head. The blooms were cool against my hair. The inner band settled lightly, perfectly, as if the thing had known me before I touched it. The hidden return line under the silver warmed at once where it met my skin. Not a route opening, not a city answer, only the quiet acknowledgement of one promise freely given and returned. When he stepped back enough to look at me in it, I saw something in his face I had not let myself imagine in full before. Peace. Not complete. Not for always. The city still needed rebuilding. The records still needed opening. The nobles and the route office and everything that would follow truth into daylight would be difficult and ugly and human. But peace nonetheless. A place in him that had found its answer and recognized home in it. The new route over the city flashed once overhead, brighter than the others, and ran westward in a line no old map had carried. Felix, tears still on his face and all dignity abandoned to history, looked up and said to absolutely no one who deserved to hear it first, "It needs a name." The line struck me then not as administrative task but as the beginning of a life. A new road. A restored name. A chosen promise under a sky no longer forced shut. Julian offered me his hand. I took it. Below us, the city of Violia saved, scarred, astonished looked up at an open crown of roads and at the prince who had chosen not a stabilizing arrangement, not a great house solution, not obedience dressed as duty, but the girl who had once run through the star festival carrying a flower crown and changed the sky by dropping it into his hands. And this time, in front of all of them, neither of us let go. Chapter 24. The Bride of the New Sky route. The second time I walked into the Starfall Square, no one was shouting at me to hurry. That alone felt unreal enough to stop me at the edge of the paving and make me laugh softly under my breath. The harbor plaza of the upper capital had been rebuilt over the summer, though rebuilt was not quite the right word. Violia did not know how to become modest even after nearly falling out of the sky. The white terraces had been repaired, yes. The cracked flight rails had been replaced. The shattered route lamps had been recast and rehung. But the square had not been restored into what it had been before. It had become something truer. The old polished arrogance was gone from it. In its place stood beauty that looked as if it had finally been forced to admit people lived there. The broad central stair had been widened to allow freight trolleys and festival carriages to pass each other without servants flattening themselves against the rails. The route markers no longer floated too high for common eyes to read. New silver inlay ran through the paving in braided lines that did not hide their practical purpose beneath decorative swirls. Even the harbor archways had changed. Above each one, worked into the pale stone and new carving, a 4-point crown and a petal band crossed and returned through one another in the old answering pattern. People touched those carvings now when they passed under them. For luck, some said. For gratitude, others. For proof, the older route workers said most honestly, because if stone can lie once under official hands, one likes to feel for the truth with one's own fingers after. The square was full tonight, not in the frantic pressed way of disaster or the feverish hungry clustering that had followed the public records hearing. This was festival fullness. Music from the lower terrace steps. Sweet smoke from honeyed nut braziers and caramel pear stalls. Ribbons flying from every rail. Children with silver dust already on their cheeks though the first ceremonial route lights had not yet risen. Lovers and widows and merchants and grandmothers and route crews, all of them wearing crowns or carrying them in their hands. It had taken months to earn a night like this. The kingdom had not mended in one miracle and gone happily back to sleep. The records had been opened, then fought over, then opened again harder. Some noble houses had submitted beautifully to truth in public and tried to wriggle around it in private. Others had surprised me. Glassmere merchants funded half the restoration of the Western harmonizers before the Treasury papers finished arguing about jurisdiction. 3 Lower Island councils demanded local archive copies and refused to surrender them once they received them. The old stewardship line, under too much light at last, cracked in places that had looked permanent from the outside. Orrin Court still lived, which was perhaps the least satisfying part of justice, but he lived without office, without seal rights, and with enough written testimony around him now that even men who preferred expedient forgetting found the effort cumbersome. People always ask whether truth changes kingdoms all at once. It doesn't. It changes where the lies can stand safely. That is different, and enough, sometimes, to build firm. The Star Weavers had been restored to the record within the month. Not gracefully, not unanimously, but publicly and in language plain enough that no second broadside could ever bury them under caution again. The old woven houses had not all survived in clean descent, but enough traces did. Belrose, yes, and others, too, though time had frayed names and trades and lineages into smaller surviving hand memories scattered across the islands. Ribbon makers, lamp binders, funeral flower women, 2 brothers on the lower freight chain who turned out to be descended from a line of route knot keepers and reacted to the news by swearing at 3 ministers and then demanding better funding for the western braces. I liked them immediately. The road itself had changed too. The great route no longer hid above the capital as a sealed wound. Its open crown remained visible only under certain light and not in the vast blinding form of that first impossible day, but its influence had restructured the city routes all the same. Old dead branches woke. Stress that once tore back into single points now spread through answered lines. The western braids had steadied enough that perishables came through in better shape again. The lower terraces, who had once felt the route crisis first in spoiled goods and climbing prices, had noticed that long before the nobles finished writing their revised histories. And the new line the great route had laid over the capital and westward through the repaired chains had been named. That had become a battle for 3 weeks. The route council wanted something grave and ancestral. Merchants wanted something practical. Half the lower city, if left unsupervised, would have called it Belrose's Run just to annoy the palace. In the end, the line received 2 names as all beloved roads do. Officially it was recorded into the open route inventory as the returning way. Unofficially, from the palace kitchens to the west chain loading docks, everyone called it the answering road. I preferred the second one. The first still felt too aware of itself. Tonight both names had been strung in silver letters over the harbor approach, and children were already arguing over which sounded more romantic. I stood just outside the square beneath the old market clock arch with my crown in both hands and let the noise and light and memory move through me before stepping any farther. The crown I held tonight was not the one from the Skyheart core. That one lived where it belonged now, not on any human head but in the heart of the opened road. This crown was mine. I had made it 3 days ago at my own work table, after destroying 2 attempts for being too careful and 1 for being too beautiful in a way that looked more like admiration than honesty. Master Alara had thrown the worst one at my shoulder and informed me that if I wanted to become royal, I could at least avoid becoming stupid with lace. So I started over. The final version had come out simpler, stronger. White star lilies at the front, because they belonged to me now in ways they had not that first festival night. A narrow inner return of silver hidden under the band. A line of small pale blue crystals no bigger than dew beads at the sides, the exact color of the deepest part of Julian's eyes when he looked at the sky and not at court papers. 3 wind looms tucked low at the back where only I would feel them and know why they mattered. And under all of it, where no one would ever see unless I chose to show them, the hidden answering channel not for a city, not for a seal, but because after learning the truth of the old work I no longer knew how to make any crown I truly cared about without giving it room to return what it held. It was not ceremonial enough for the old court, too honest for it. That pleased me. Someone called my name from the square. Not loudly, warmly. I looked up and found Felix at the lower stair rail, waving one scandalously elegant gloved hand above his head with the complete lack of dignity that becomes a man only after public victory and private friendship both loosen him from fear of being seen. He had dressed himself in formal midnight blue for the festival and had somehow contrived to tuck 2 document slips and a measuring quill into the inner pocket of the coat anyway. Some things even triumph cannot cure. When he saw that I had stopped under the arch like a confused village bride with too many eyes on her, he cupped both hands around his mouth and called, "If you faint here, history will be intolerable about it." Several people turned. I laughed. The tension in my shoulders broke cleanly with it. Then Marcus stepped into view behind Felix and, with all the grave authority of a man commanding a warship under storm conditions, took Felix by the back of the collar and removed him from the rail before he could further damage the dignity of the upper square. I walked forward smiling. The first thing I saw as I entered the harbor plaza proper was the new route ship. Not the Lumina, though she lay at the farther royal berth tonight under formal lanterns, gleaming restored and somehow prouder now that her old hidden marks no longer had to pretend at mere decoration. This was the new vessel, anchored at the central public rise where everyone in the square could see her. She was not enormous. She was beautiful. Built on the old royal hull geometry but widened at the middle decks for passenger and trade balance, painted in deep white with silver seams following the new braid pattern, and fitted with route sails that caught the open crown light above and turned it pale blue at the edges. Along her prow ran the new line mark of the answering road, the 4-point crown and petal band returning into one another without trap or break. Her name had been painted under the bow in silver script clear enough to read even at distance. The Promise of Dawn. Julian had said that name was too poetic. Then he kept saying it when he thought no one heard. So the council voted for it on the third day. I never told him that Felix and I had arranged the final phrasing by bribing 2 route clerks with sugared pears and a better archival shelf allocation. The public debut of the first formal ship to sail the answering road should have been enough ceremony for any one night. The city had disagreed. So tonight also held the reopening of the Starfall Festival under the restored route crown, the dedication of the new Western line, the first public route blessing under the restored Starweaver record, and because the city had now spent 6 months breathing through the aftershock of almost losing itself and had earned at least one straightforward happiness, the formal wedding of its crown prince. I still had not entirely accepted that last one belonged to me too. The square knew, of course. No one had been subtle for weeks. The seamstresses in the market had taken bets on whether I would wear court silk or my own work. The lower terraces had begun calling me flower bride so often that Master Ilara threatened to start charging them a tidal tax. 3 elderly nobles who had ignored my existence at the first palace festival now sent me route weather forecasts twice weekly for the convenience of your hair arrangements. One little girl in the West Quarter had asked in total seriousness whether becoming future queen meant I would have to stop swearing when stems snapped. I told her I hoped not. Master Ilara, overhearing, said it would be my only qualification she trusted. I crossed the square slowly enough to let people see me and quickly enough not to become ridiculous about it. They noticed. Of course they noticed. Some bowed. Some smiled. Some only stared, still not fully accustomed to the reality that the girl from the workshop quarter now walked the upper harbor with a crown in her own hands and no one hurried her as though she existed merely to serve someone else's moment. A route porter from Glassmere lifted 2 fingers to his brow as I passed. I knew him only by face, one of the men who had helped rig the Western temporary lines during the first repairs. I returned the gesture and saw him grin before he turned away as if that was enough gossip to take home for a week. At the central stair, Vivienne waited. Not to intercept, to stand witness. She wore deep silver blue tonight, not the frost colors of old expectation. The gown was cut in court form but without the excess softness older noblewomen still favored. Its clean lines doing her the courtesy of acknowledging she had better things to do than float decoratively through history. A narrow chain of star sapphires lay at her throat. One of House Harrow's older ceremonial pins held back the dark fall of her hair at one side. Someone else might have tried to make her tragic for remaining unchosen or bitter for standing there at all. They would have been fools. Vivienne looked exactly like what she had become over these months, one of the strongest supports the kingdom had and fully aware of it. "You're late," she said as I reached the stair. I held up the crown in my hands. I had to decide whether the left side needed another silver return. Did it? No. She nodded once, as if I had passed a test only she and I understood. Then her gaze softened by a hair, enough that no one else would have noticed. "You look like yourself." It was the highest compliment she could have offered me in that place. "You don't look disappointed," I said. "How terribly observant of you." I laughed again. The festival had made that easier tonight. Or perhaps surviving a falling city had permanently damaged my ability to feel properly solemn when joy appeared. Vivienne's eyes flicked to the crown in my hands and then back to my face. "The council wants the formal naming to follow the blessing, but the Western merchants are threatening mutiny unless the first freight dedication happens before the vows." That sounds like Felix's influence. It is Marcus's, actually. He says no honest man trusts a celebration until someone has checked the cargo balance. That did sound like Marcus. We stood for one quiet beat in the edge of the crowd while music from the lower rail rose and fell around us. Then Vivienne stepped slightly aside, opening the central view of the square. "He's been looking toward the arch every 30 seconds, she said. It was becoming intolerable. My pulse betrayed me instantly. She saw, ignored it with great courtesy. "Thank you," I said softly. This time, when her mouth curved, it held something warmer than irony. "You're welcome, Cora." She used my name easily now. That still moved me more than it should have. At the top of the stair, Marcus waited in full formal black. There are men who become less dangerous in ceremonial clothing. Marcus Hale was not among them. The jacket only made him look more like the law had taken human form and found it insufficiently disciplined. A silver captain's chain crossed one shoulder. His gloves were spotless. The old scar at his jaw remained exactly where it had always been, proving at least one thing in the world refused to be improved for presentation. When I reached him, he gave the crown in my hands one glance, then looked directly at me. "Do not trip," he said. "That's all. You asked me to help with your nerves, not your ego." I asked for neither. He held my gaze one beat longer, then gave the smallest nod I had ever seen from him. It meant more than speeches would have. "Your ship is ready," he said. "Not your ceremony. Not your prince. Your ship." The promise of dawn waited beyond the stair. The answering road burned above it. The city still stood where it should. In Marcus's world, this was how one named happiness, by confirming the route was sound. I stepped past him and into the center of the square. Julian stood at the far end beneath the main harbor arch, with the open crown of Rhodes over the capital lighting his shoulders in pale silver and blue. Everything else blurred. He wore white tonight, not the soft, decorative white of court pageants. Bright, clean white with silver work at the cuffs and the old route crown mark newly restored at the collar. No jeweled excess. No heavy royal mantle. The whole cut of the clothing left him what he had become in the city's eyes and mine both, not a distant prince on display, but the visible heart of a road the kingdom now trusted to answer rather than command. He had changed too, in months too quiet for most people to notice properly. The route strain had not left him. It never fully would, not after years of the crown line taking more than it should have. But the opened road had changed its shape in him. The old tightness at the mouth during route surges had eased. The haunted half-listening he once carried under every public smile no longer sat in him all the time. He looked more like a man living inside his own body and less like one politely renting it from the kingdom. When he saw me with the crown in my hands, everything in his face changed anyway. No court training can survive being looked at by the right person at the right moment without cracking somewhere true. I walked toward him. The harbor square had become silent enough that I could hear the soft brush of my own skirts and the faint tap of my shoes on the new inlaid stone. The same square where I had once run breathless and frantic through festival crowds with a delivery crown against my chest now opened before me in one clear line. No shoving shoulders. No fearful haste. No dropped work and no impossible stranger appearing out of light. Only him, waiting. Halfway there, I looked down once at the paving and saw the new silver braid lines underfoot. The old harbor scar had been repaired. The place where I had almost fallen had been rebuilt into a stronger seam crossing, and around it some stonemason with more honesty than the court deserved had worked a tiny hidden pattern into the edge, a petal and a 4-point star turned back toward one another. No plaque. No explanation. Only memory made useful. I smiled and kept walking. Julian descended the last 2 steps from the arch before protocol could stop him. Not all the way. Only enough. Just enough to show the whole square, the whole capital, that he had never intended to wait on a higher stair while I crossed the rest alone. The gesture went through the crowd like a bright low murmur. I heard it without hearing words. Approval, tenderness, delight, a little scandal from the older nobles who still preferred affection sorted by rank. Good. Let them. He stopped before me. Up close, under the rout crown light, I could see every precise mark of the months between us. The fine white line near his temple where falling stone in the boundary ruin had cut him. The faint rout scars still lingering under the right cuff. The warmth in his eyes so open now that I no longer knew how to survive it elegantly and had given up trying. You didn't make me wait long, he said softly. That's very generous. I stopped under the market arch for at least half a lifetime. I know. One corner of his mouth lifted. Marcus timed it. That startled an actual laugh out of me. He would. Julian's gaze dropped briefly to the crown in my hands. May I see? I lifted it. He did not take it immediately. He looked first the way he always looked when my work truly mattered, carefully, with his attention resting in the structure and not merely on the visible beauty. His fingers touched the inner band lightly. The hidden return line warmed under them. This one is yours, he said. Yes. For tonight. For whatever comes after tonight too, I think. The words slipped out before I could soften them. His eyes lifted to mine at once. Again the world narrowed. Not because the crowd mattered less. Because all of it, the road, the city, the work, the vow already spoken in another chamber under greater danger, had made public witness feel less like exposure and more like completion. Good, he said. That was all. A simple word. Yet I felt the answer of it all through me. The formal blessing should have begun there. The officiant from the restored rout guild waited 3 steps above us with a ceremonial silver basin and the dedication text. Felix, somewhere to our left, was already visibly emotional enough to embarrass several archives. Marcus had the face of a man resigned to survival, continuing under less controllable emotional conditions than he would have designed. Vivienne stood where the noble lines could see her approval and take warning from it if needed. Instead of turning to the officiant, Julian held out his hands to me. I placed the crown in them. The officiant, wise man that he was, closed his mouth and let the kingdom learn how moments actually move. Julian lifted the crown. Not high for the crowd, only enough to settle it over my hair with the careful surety of someone who had learned by now exactly how to touch what mattered without bruising it. The hidden silver band met my skin and answered at once. Not with blinding rout fire. Not with city-scale opening. Only with a deep quiet warmth that traveled around the circle and back, as if the crown itself had exhaled and recognized where it belonged. His fingers lingered a second too long near my temple. Good. Let them see that too. When he stepped back enough to look at me in it, I saw the same expression in him I had seen on the square when he chose me before the whole city, only quieter now and somehow even more devastating for that. Then the officiant decided the kingdom could be trusted not to combust from tenderness and raised the ceremonial basin. The blessing was brief. Not because he lacked poetry, because Violia had spent enough time lately learning the difference between ornament and truth. He named the opened road, the restored line, the city held by answer and not command, the promise returned freely, the shared work of keeping routes honest and homes standing. He blessed the first sailing of the promise of dawn and the joining of crown and answer not above the people, but among them. I liked him for that. When he finished, Felix somehow contained himself long enough to perform the official naming of the new westward line without weeping into the cylinder case at his side, though only barely. Under open route authority, he read, voice ringing through the harbor square, the restored capital to western braid is entered into the living inventory as the returning way, known in common route speech as the answering road, first held under the reopened crown by shared accord and city witness on the night of the restored starfall. At that, the route lamps along the harbor rails lit, all of them, in one clean answering sequence. From the upper arch to the lower berths to the public freight rise where the promise of dawn waited, White-silver light ran the length of the square and then outward into the city. The crowd broke into cheering so fierce I could feel it through the paving. Julian looked at me over the brightness and laughed once, helpless and beautiful. "Your city approves," he said. "Our city," I answered. I do not know whether the crowd heard that line or only saw its shape in our faces. Either way, the cheer changed when I said it. Not louder, deeper, the kind of sound that belongs to a people deciding they have permission to belong to a future and not merely survive into it. The wedding itself was almost simple after that. The officiant asked the formal questions. We answered. Not because the law required certainty, because certainty had already been proved in every rout chamber, broken stair, and impossible sky between the harbor festival night and this one. When the final words were spoken and the silver basin tipped its blessing light over our joined hands, the open crown of roads above the Capitol flashed once more, not dangerously, only like recognition and the promise of dawn at the central berth answered by lifting her rout sails into full silver. The city roared approval. Julian kissed me, not quickly for the crowd, not elaborately for history, with the kind of steadiness that made the whole square disappear for one impossible heartbeat even while half the kingdom watched. His hand came to the side of my face exactly where it had in the sky-heart chamber, and all the light and road and music and surviving sky seemed to narrow to the pressure of his mouth and the warmth of his breath and the absolute certainty that there had never again been any road worth taking that did not answer through him too. When we broke apart, Felix was openly crying. Marcus looked resigned to it in the way men do when civilization fails around them in ways technically harmless. Vivienne had the expression of someone satisfied that the world, for once, had chosen the correct scandal. Master Alara, standing farther back than rank would have placed her and much closer than the old court would once have allowed, caught my eye from the lower stair and mimed, very clearly, about time. I laughed so hard I had to wipe my eyes. After that came bells, music, too many blessings to remember cleanly, 3 Western merchants arguing joyfully over who had claim to the first freight dedication, and one elderly noblewoman informing me with deep gravity that the crown sat correctly and therefore perhaps the gods were not entirely whimsical after all. Then Marcus announced, with the ruthless timing of a captain who knows how to cut through softness before it becomes paralysis, that the first ceremonial departure window for the answering road would close in 11 minutes if everyone wished to stop emotionalizing and get on the ship. So we did. The promise of dawn received us not as a floating ballroom but as a real vessel with lantern heat in her corridors, route crews at ready stations, fresh cargo tied properly under blessing cloth, and enough room on the upper deck for the first official passengers and witnesses. Merchants boarded with ledgers. Route workers boarded with practical awe. 2 old women from the lower terraces were brought up last because someone in the crowd had cried that they had both survived the West crash 20 years ago and therefore had earned the right to stand on the first restored crossing if they wished. They wished. Vigorously. I loved the city very much then. Julian and I stood at the stern rail as the harbor cruise cast off. Below us, the Starfall Square shone brighter than it had on the night I first ran across it. Not because the lanterns were finer, because the fear under the beauty had changed shape. The city no longer looked like a kingdom trying to hide its cracks under polished white stone. It looked like something scarred and still willing to light itself fully. The opened crown of roads above Violia glimmered in the deepening night, silver lines visible now with the first true dark. Beyond the Capitol, farther west, the answering road burned clean through the upper sky in a line so beautiful it hurt. "You remember the first time," Julian said. Not a question. Of course he knew I did. I looked down at the square where the musicians near the lower stair were now playing something faster and wilder than any court dance would have permitted, and where children had already begun weaving through the adults with their crowns slipping crooked over one ear. "Yes," I said. "I remember thinking if I dropped that first crown, I might die of humiliation before the fall finished it." "You nearly did fall. You're very comforting." He smiled and looked out over the road ahead. The wind off the opened route moved through his hair and under the silver collar of his formal coat and made him seem, for one heartbeat, exactly as impossible and real as the first night had promised. Then he turned to me, and the impossibility became ordinary in the way only true love can make it. "You're not carrying anyone else's delivery this time," he said. "No. What are you carrying, then?" I touched the hidden inner band of my own crown, then took his hand. Everything I chose. The route crew called departure. The promise of dawn shuddered once, caught the new road, and rose. Below us, Byerlia did not fall away like a dream I had once been too low to touch. It opened beneath us properly white towers, working terraces, rebuilt bridges, bright harbor, the square where I had once run and been caught and where tonight I had walked and been chosen openly. The city looked smaller from above, as all cities do, but never again unreachable. The answering road stretched westward in silver through the starfall night. Ahead lay Glassmere, the repaired chains, the outer routes, the work of rebuilding, the opening of more archives, the arguments to come, the laws to rewrite, the old houses to restore, the new roads to name, the whole ordinary impossible future of a kingdom that had nearly died and now had to learn how to live honestly. Julian's hand closed around mine. Not to steady me. Not because he feared I would fall. Only because that was how we stood now. Below, the city cheered as the first ship of the opened road climbed into the night. Above, the stars and the restored routes answered one another in clean silver lines. And with my own crown on my head, my husband beside me, and the future finally running toward us instead of away, I looked up and saw that the sky was no longer something I had to dream about reaching. It was home.